Hello everybody and welcome to the game of the day. Today we are going to feature a game between Peter Leko and Giri. I've been trying to, get for this tournament, since this is the Legends of Chess event, I'm trying to show a little bit of everybody. And today's game by Peter Leko, this is a win for Peter Leko. I'm not going to hide this for this one because it's not the most like sort of topsy-turvy affair. I think it's more straightforward. So I'm not going to hide the result. But I think what was noteworthy was that Giri gave such lavish praise for this game when he was interviewed after the match. Giri did win this match, but gave high praise to this game played by Peter Leko with white. It's an interesting game. It's also an opening we haven't looked at too much, I feel. So it's good to get exposure to some different things. And yeah, I'm looking forward to showing this game. I hope you will enjoy it. It's a little bit less of a tactical slugfest than some game of the day. They sometimes tend to kind of drift towards the more tactical, complicated games. But today it's more of a positional game, but a really interesting one, and one where Peter Leko played incredibly well. So I thought it was a great one to show. So let's get started here. It starts with d4, knight f6. By the way, sometimes I like to also mention sort of my honorable mentions for today. And today, one game that I considered was one that was played early between Magnus Carlsen and Ding Liren. The game where Magnus won with the white pieces in this anti-Botvinnik or Moran structure was a very sort of quick win for Magnus in a pretty spectacular fashion. But I thought it just wasn't Ding Liren's best game, and that was one of the reasons why I chose this game instead. So Peter Leko here goes for the Catalan. Both sides have a lot of experience. Peter Leko is known to be very well prepared. He's someone who's been as close to being world champion, probably closer than anyone else to have been world champion almost, who never made it, when he lost the match to Vladimir Kramnik, just extremely close. Was one draw away with the black pieces from holding and becoming a world champion. So really, really close. Someone with a lot of class. Also, he's a great commentator and a gentleman when he's on our broadcast. Everybody loves him with reason, and so nice to show one of his victories today. So Anish plays bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop e7. This is one of the main setups that he plays. Recently, I think he also has tried this move a5, but bishop e7 is sort of a staple in his repertoire. Anish, definitely one of the better prepared players on the tour, and so was Peter Leko, by the way, was an incredibly well prepared player back in the day. Now that he's a little bit less active, I suppose he probably would not speak as highly about his preparation, but those guys, they still have some pretty deep, pretty comprehensive files on all kinds of openings. So they follow here the main line of the Catalan, sort of what I would call the old main line, I guess, something that's been played and studied a whole lot. c6, rook d1. There's a few different move orders for white. Having checked on b4 for black reduces a little bit white's options because they can't play b3, bishop b2. That's part of the idea. So the bishop the bishop on d2 is not very well placed. So the bishop will normally move again to either f4, even back to c1 sometimes, or to c3 and play knight d2. So, but in this game, so he plays b6 here after rook d1, b3. b3 is normal because If white wants to play knight c3, they don't necessarily want to give this pawn. There are variations where you try to sacrifice it, but b3 protects the pawn. And now Anish plays one of the moves. There's really three main moves here, and he plays a5, which he's played before at least a few times I could see. The old sort of classical main lines start with either bishop a6 or bishop b7, and the positions are a little bit different there, where white normally plays knight c3 and black tries to play c5. Now on bishop a6 used to be very, very popular, and now I guess the line with a4 a5 is considered maybe to be a little bit annoying for the black pieces, so maybe that's why Anish here plays a5. Of course, all this is there's a lot of theory, and the Catalan now has massive books written about it, so we can't cover it all in 15 minutes for sure. But it is sort of an interesting, very subtle opening. Now Peter Leko plays bishop c3, so he's preparing to play knight d2, and now black plays knight e4. So knight e4 is one of these moves that creates the possibility of playing more like a stonewall, where white has maybe not played the most efficient or the most rapid development. And I remember in the Magnus Carlsen video that was published on chess24 called Attacking Without Sacrificing, I think. Oh no, there's a video on the stonewall. So on this video on the stonewall, he talks about how this playing knight e4 and f5 in the Catalan is what he considers to be one of the best ways to get a stonewall structure, versus getting it by playing, on move d4, play f5, and then play it this way, the most direct way, which of course does not hide your intention. So white can then really choose the setup that they feel is preferable. In this case with knight e4, white is already kind of committed to a few things, so fewer options. Now this has all been played before. There was also a game here I was going to show just to give an example of bishop b7, knight d2. I'm just showing a few moves from a game between Yakovenko in Arkhiev with white, actually. So one of these kind of typical Catalan debates where we get these pawns all facing each other, and nobody wants to blink. And in this game, white had maybe a slight advantage, but eventually black was okay. So bishop b7 is another perfectly reasonable move. So in a game after knight e4, Peter Leko plays knight to e5. Knight takes, pawn take. Oh, sorry, knight takes, bishop takes e4, which is sort of the idea. And f5. Now, the funny thing is Anish has actually had a couple of games here, or at least one game in this exact position. And in a previous game, which was against Dingley Ren, none other than Dingley Ren, several years ago in Moscow, Dingley Ren had played bishop takes d5. And here after e takes d5, pawn takes e5, f4. They had a really complicated game. This looks a little bit bizarre from the black perspective because you allow this pawn to be weak. However, black does get a lot of counterplay, and white is sort of missing having a bishop on g2 here. And this game is actually very complicated. I'll just show you very quickly because it ends in it's without analysis, just to kind of show the craziness that they got themselves into here. So very messy. Black looks like they're about to checkmate, and then suddenly white is just in time to sacrifice a piece, get some counterplay, and the game ended in a draw here. But a messy game. I'm sure both of the guys here knew of this game, and here Peter Leko plays bishop g2, which has actually been played before. I think it was played even before bishop takes d5. More quiet, more normal move. And now we get sort of a more or less, even though they traded knights in a funny way in the center, we get a more or less normal position. Again, pretty stable position. Peter plays e3, and now h5. So I think Anish was still in his preparation here, and this move seems to be the favorite move of Leela, at least on my computer, running for a couple minutes. So it's interesting, right? We always talk about AlphaZero and these the neural network engines like these h-pawn forward attacks, and in this case he does it again. And I think the game looks tough for black, but I'm not sure that h5 is the culprit. There were other games. I saw one with bishop b7, but I do think here white is a little bit better, just because structurally it's a good position for white. They can take on d5 whenever they want. And it doesn't seem like black has too much counterplay for just having sort of a static weakness on e5. It's not necessarily much, but it looks a little better for white. So it's interesting that Anish played h5. Anish always an interesting player to follow in the opening. Knight d2, h4, h3, knight f6. And I think this reaction from Peter was actually a good one. He played pawn takes h4 here, which sort of challenges black to create something, because you take a pawn, you potentially might get two bishops if black tries to take that pawn back. And so I think it was a good way to challenge the black plan of h5, because if you don't play h3 and g takes h4, then I think black's plan has essentially been a success. They'll play something like bishop d6 and then either rook f6 h6 or queen f6 queen h6. And it seems like black's plan has been they can take on g3, and it seems like it's a good thing that black achieved by playing h5, h4. But here after pawn takes h4, black has to be careful. And in the game, so he plays knight e4, very natural. White, of course, does not want to take, allowing pawn takes, and then eventually this pawn will fall, and the pawn on f2 will be targeted. So he plays knight to f3. And now what Anish did was very understandable, but if I'm going to criticize anything in this game, it might be this coming plan. Because in this position, so he played bishop d7, and it's kind of subtle. You can see why black would think, I don't need to take this pawn on h4 because I can really take it at any moment. And that's a very reasonable thought, I think. That being said, there's a little issue with what happens here, and I think the culprit is this move bishop d7. I do think that probably Anish could have taken on h4 right away, and then white has a kind of tough decision to make. They can take on h4, which I think that's probably what he would have done. Queen takes h4, and then bishop e1 to prepare or threaten f3. But this position actually looks fairly okay. I looked at a few, so f3 is a threat, so you got to move the queen again. I looked at either queen g5, queen h5, or queen h6. The computer prefers queen h6, and let's just give the computer the benefit of the doubt. But the main reason is actually understandable, is that on queen h5 in particular, which my natural instinct was to play queen h5 with knight g5, try to go for these squares. But f3 is actually a decent response, and it's still complicated, this position, but I think the computer prefers queen h6 because from there the queen can take on f3, can take on e3. I'm sorry. So, but either way, I mean, I think this position is not that bad for black. They've given up their dark squared bishop, but they have the possibility of playing knight g5, maybe rook f6, rook g6. Maybe the bishop can come to a6 to put pressure, or it can, just go to d7 and sort of wait. I couldn't find really an advantage for white here, so I think that might be Anish's best in this position if this opening were to be repeated. But in the game, he plays bishop d7. Let's see the difference. So white plays bishop e1. He goes bishop e8. So he's sort of taking his time. Now after knight e5, finally he does take it. And by the way, I don't think taking here would have worked, by the way, if he tries to delay it by just one move, because now f3 has got to be pretty good. This knight on g3 is not going to be stable. We can play queen f2 or even king h2, probably wins a piece either way. Yeah, so he couldn't take now. So clearly after bishop d7, it's kind of like, yeah, he says A, he's got to say B. But now the difference is that Peter Leko plays knight e5, and after he takes the pawn f3, now black is forced to trade these bishops, and that's a very nice trade for white, who's left with the knight on e5 with no bishop opposing it. So it becomes a positionally preferable position for white. And so after Peter gets this position here, he plays the rest of the game really beautifully. And it's not easy to say how Anish could have played better. And because of that, that's why I think Anish praised it so much afterwards, because it's not an easy... It's not necessarily... It's clear that white has a preferable position, but to go from there and winning it in such convincing fashion is not so trivial at all. All right, so black plays rook f6. He tries to drum up a little counterplay. Rook c1, knight f7, trying to trade knights, and now Peter Leko makes a very good decision. He keeps the knights on the board. I think the position just has a little bit more bite for white with knights on the board. It's whenever you're going to have chances to attack, you generally want to have knights around because knights are such good helpers to the major pieces because they do something that the major pieces don't do, right? They jump, they control other squares. So so it makes a lot of sense to keep these knights. Black plays b5. I did wonder after seeing what happens in the game, in hindsight 2020, whether the next few moves that Anish plays here, now he plays a4, these moves that ultimately trade these pawns, whether that actually helps white more than black. That being said, if he just sat and waited forever, which first of all it's not an easy thing to do, it does seem like eventually white is going to make progress sort of on both wings, right? They have the possibility of playing rook g1, maybe playing a little bit on the king side, but they also have the option of taking on d5 at various points and trying to penetrate on the c file. So it's not an easy position in any way for black to hold. But we'll see that after these pawns get traded here, rook g6, white plays c5. It's actually a very difficult position for black. I mean, probably already just lost, especially when you see the game after, because this rook is actually quite far from the action, and white has the opportunity now to try to really infiltrate on the queen side, and he does so really beautifully in the game. So black plays rook a3, queen f2, just a solid move, sort of going backwards to go forward later. Queen a8. Now he plays a nice move, rook to c2, prevents rook a2. So it's a sort of a beautiful example of prophylaxis, the next several moves. Bishop d7, rook b2. So now he's preparing to play rook b1. Anish doesn't see anything better than coming back. And now the position is already dominating, a dominant position for white. Rook b7, rook h6, queen b2. He's putting all of the pieces on the b file. And right now he probably wants to play queen b6 next move. King f8. So king f8 prepares to, after a queen trade, he prepares to defend the bishop on d7. So now Peter switches gear and plays rook a1, which trades the sole active rook because this rook on h6 is offside. So this is a very good trade for white. Now he's preparing to play queen a7, which is a big threat. King e7 is forced. He repeats moves once here and finds a great plan here, bishop f1. This is a really nice move, actually. And I think Anish might have missed his next move, which was sort of the threat of bishop f1. He probably thought that Peter was trying to do something like this, or bishop d3, c2, a4, which would be a probably winning plan, actually. But there's an even stronger threat, which if you spot it, good on you. And but there was nothing really that Anish could do here. The computer, wants to try something like queen e8, but then white can play not what they play in the game, because the idea is to play knight to d8 in some cases, but he can play simply rook c7, which prevents knight d8 because knight d8 will be met with knight e5, pinning this bishop, and black is completely stuck here. Plus white might be threatening to take on c6, so this would still be a lost position. But in the game, Anish plays g6, and after g6, white plays a very nice finishing move here, which I'll give you a few seconds to try to spot. Can always pause the video, of course. He plays bishop b5. So this is a really, really nice move. Finishes things off in style here. The idea is that on pawn takes b5, we play c6. So once you see it, it's obvious, but it's one of these moves that is hard to see because it's not necessarily natural to look at a piece landing on the b5 square. And so after c6, white is winning, and this is what happened in the game because there's not really a better way to play. You can't play king e8 because there's actually a few reasons, but you could play rook b8 and win the queen. You could also probably play bishop takes c6 and win this knight, and that might be even stronger. So he decides to play pawn takes b5, c6, king f6, rook takes d7, queen f8 is forced. Now Peter Leko plays knight e5, a very cruel move because knight takes e5 allows checkmate in one. So black plays knight h6. Some ideas of playing knight g4 sometimes, so he's got to be a little bit careful. Now Peter Leko finds one more nice tactic here to kind of finish things off. I will give you a few seconds to maybe spot it. Rook f7, very nice. Using the fact that the king and queen are in a position to be forked. That's something where when you're trying to spot tactics, you always want to spot these possible forks. If you see that, you always look for possibilities. I also always say, always check it might be mate. So always, when you have checks at your disposal, make sure that they don't work before you don't play them. So rook f7, very nice move. Forces the win of the queen for rook and knight, and then the rest of the game is pretty straightforward. He took it this way. Knight takes f7 would not be any better because the c pawn is so strong here that, for example, on rook takes, we'll play queen d7, a good move to control the c8 square and keep the pin, and then c7, c8 will come. So he plays queen takes f7, knight f7, knight f7, queen d7. He's preparing the same plan as we looked at. Now Anish played rook d8, and there's one more cute little tactic. So we get three nice little mini combinations at the end to finish this game here. Of course, white would be winning in several ways, but Leko here plays the most beautiful and cleanest. Queen takes rook, knight takes c7, and that's actually a very common theme when you can attack a knight with a pawn. That pawn can often queen. So that's one to remember if you've never seen this kind of schema. It does happen sometimes. And on king e7, of course, white would queen and not take the knight and be completely winning. So this was a really beautiful positional game by Peter Leko. He's had some ups and downs in this tournament, but the legends are really holding their own. I think probably maybe a little bit better than people might have thought. I think they've done well. With the exception maybe of Anand that people thought would do a lot better, including myself. And Anand's actually played really, really well, but he's gotten a little bit low on time, and he's also lost a bunch of Armageddon games. The Armageddon has not been his friend, but he's clearly up there in terms of, it's not a question of level even right now. He's definitely up there. He's just somehow the results have not come in. But a beautiful game by Peter Leko, and it's nice to see him do more than respectfully in this event. Even though he did lose this match to Anish, who managed to win 2 other games. So this is the game of the day for today. We'll be back tomorrow for more action. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone.